Canberra, the most boring city in Australia. A town where absolutely nothing happens, and if it does, it's generally quite boring in itself. Before the one person from Canberra who watches this actually complains, I live here, it's boring, Floriade is overrated. But sometimes, we do have funny things happen, like when two senators dressed up as pigs. Or when another senator dressed up in a burqa. Or when a Soviet spy defected without telling his wife because he was hooked on prostitutes and started a complete mess of diplomacy that shattered one of our major political parties. Yes, that happened. We start our story in March 1953, when the great supreme leader and genocidal dick that is Stalin died the way he deserved, alone and soaked in his own piss and hopefully in incredible pain. His death, though, caused a bit of upheaval within the good old Sovietsky Soyuz, as everyone woke up from their collective Stockholm syndrome and tried to figure out who exactly was now going to be in charge of this shit show. Now, in the wake of Stalin's death, there were a couple major players left over who conceivably could have taken the mantle, namely Jeffrey Tambor, Michael Palin, Simon Biel and Steve Buscemi. Wait, no, hang on, that's not right. Yes, Lavrenti Beria, Vyacheslav Molotov, Georgy Malikov, and the person nobody expected, Nikita Khrushchev. Beria had spent many years at the very top of the NKVD for simplicity's purposes, the not yet KGB, entrenching his position and manoeuvring himself in such a way that should the opportunity arise, that he would be able to seize power from the relatively weak Malenkov, who was Stalin's notional successor. At least in terms of how the government was supposed to work, but this is the Soviet Union. Supposed to and how it actually works are two different things. It really is hard to describe Beria in any other way than Stalin's answer to Heinrich Himmler. Beria is the person who organised the Katyn massacre, along with further targeted mass killings focused against the Polish intelligentsia. More commonly forgotten, in the 1920s, this horrific bastard also was directly responsible for the execution of 10,000 Georgians. Beria also was responsible for the blocker battalions and the deportations and deaths of hundreds of thousands of people from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania to the gulags. Not to mention what he did to the Caucasus outside of Georgia. Beria is the very epitome of Russification, at the very centre of some of the most horrific ethnic cleansing known to humankind. This is before we even get into the allegations of... It's 3 minutes into the video? Yeah, I can say that. Before we get into the allegations of rape against young girls and women, and the beatings, the torture. Beria truly was the worst in every sense of the word. At his fingertips, he commanded the tentacles of the Soviet secret police and espionage throughout the world. Thankfully, in 1953, Beria's story had an equally happy ending to Stalin's, and he was shot in the head. Khrushchev, the dark horse that nobody expected, with his power base in the Ukrainian SSR and friends in high places, outsmarted the untouchable spy chief. Maybe it was the fact that everyone was tired of the purges and Beria holding control over their lives. Maybe it was arrogance on Beria's part. Maybe it was just the fact that they were done with the horror and the fear of Stalin and knew that Beria would be worse. But Khrushchev managed to win out at the end of the day, first ruling as part of a committee and then taking sole power. Khrushchev changed everything. He was, by Stalin's standards, an incredibly progressive leader who destroyed the status quo made by Stalin through fear and execution. He changed so much so fast through his tenure in power that he was actually allowed to retire in obscurity. He wasn't killed. That is something particularly notable in the halls of the Kremlin. Khrushchev changed so much that he was allowed to live. But that's getting a little too far ahead. Right now, it's 1954. Beria had done the best thing in his life by ingesting a liberal amount of brass to the head, and now this new guy who rose to power on the back of his death is in charge. For the not yet KGB people, this was terrifying. One of such people was a man named Vladimir Petrov. And yes, I'm aware that is the most generic sounding Russian name of the planet, but just bear with me a minute. Petrov had been sent as totally not a spy, and totally definitely a diplomat, to the city of Canberra. That is the capital city of Australia for those who for some reason still think in 2024 that our capital city is Sydney. Receiving this assignment in 1951 allegedly by Beria himself. It's unknown exactly what his role was, but there is a fair bit of evidence to say that he was here to start a little spy ring himself. When the news slowly started to filter out of the Soviet Union that Beria had in fact been executed, Petrov, for the lack of a better word, completely shit his pants, thinking that the moment he went back, he would be purged as a Beria man. And so, Petrov, likely not telling his wife any of this whatsoever, we'll see more why later, reached out to the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, better known as ASIO, through his contact, part-time ASIO agent and proud Pole Michael Bielowski. Michael had actually secretly been working over Petrov for a while, and was more than happy to set his defection in motion. It was time for some cheeky Australian shenanigans. Now, my dear viewer, you're probably wondering what the seventh hell an Australian Security Intelligence Organisation is. Well, I'm glad you asked. It is one of the two major Australian intelligence agencies. Think of it kind of like a halfway house between the CIA and FBI. Our overseas intelligence agency in Australia is called ASIS, our CIA if you will, and it is known as the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, but it works largely within the confines of ASIO's infrastructure. These guys are the kind of variety of spies that most Australians don't even know exist, and quite often, if they do, it's because they screwed up and an SAS team is rapidly approaching their location. See what happened to the Australian citizen who joined ISIS and plotted a terror attack in a major city. I'm sure the SAS guys had a lot of fun giggling to him as they told him that the drone was coming to his location very, very quickly. I won't give you the grisly details, but he did his best sausage sizzle impression a little while later in Iraq. But what about domestic issues? Well, that falls under ASIO, or the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, as I mentioned just before. Now, ASIO differs a little from its American half-sibling, the FBI, in that for crime at a federal level, because, we are a federal system, sort of with a little bit of input from the Washington system. We call it Westminster and Washington put together. We actually have the Australian Federal Police that deal with federal crime, or AFP. ASIO focuses solely on intelligence, and it was founded in 1949. ASIO is an incredibly secretive service. There is no romanticisation through shows like Homeland or Jack Ryan here. They work completely in the shadows, but they're still Australians. This brings us to the location of the Soviet embassy, now the Russian embassy in Canberra. The one I screamed at. This one. Which is just across the road from the Kingo, and just down the road from Monica Cricket Oval. The Kingo, for those who are naturally confused, is short for Kingston Pub, and it's, funnily enough, a pub in the suburb of Kingston. Now, there is something rather interesting about the Kingston Pub, and it's the location of the beer gardens, because there are more than one, and they're kind of oddly placed from each other. The larger of the two pushes right up against the road and has a space for tables right next to a particularly interesting place to shrubline. That's right, the pub was a hotbed for sneakily listening onto the Soviet embassy. Aussie James Bond could have a schooner of beer while spying on the Soviets after coming from the cricket. There is so much about this that I find personally hilarious, and just quintessentially Australian. ASIO knew pretty early on that a Soviet spy was on his way or had just arrived in Australia by the name of Petrov, and as I mentioned with Michael Bielowski, they went straight to work seeing what fun could be had and what secrets could be picked from his brain. Shortly after his arrival, the part-time agent, Mr. Polish Michael, made contact and slowly started to work over Petrov through regular trips to visit prostitutes in King's Cross and Sydney. Yeah, he really had to work hard to convince him, didn't he? Mr. Cheeky Michael, finding out that Petrov was terrified to go home, then introduced him to the senior ASIO field officer, Ron Richards. Petrov was offered asylum and a crisp 5,000 Australian pounds, which is about 200,000-ish in dollary dues in modern Australian currency. At the time, we used the Australian pound, not the Australian dollar. It's a whole thing. A plan was set in place that Petrov would defect, and the code name given to the operation was Operation Cabin 12. It was a standard practice in ASIO to name defectors and potential defectors as cabin candidates. I don't know why. I don't know. It's weird. You think we could have thought of a better name. Operation Cabin 12 went off without a hitch on the 3rd of April 1954, and Petrov came over to the Australian side. However, there was a slight problem. Petrov didn't tell his wife that he was defecting. Now, this is probably not too highly shocking to you, dear viewer, considering his propensity for ladies of the night. But how exactly do you think the Soviet government reacted to knowing Evdokia Petrova was out there and, well, her husband had defected? Well, they immediately said that Australia kidnapped Vladimir Petrov and then sent two couriers to fetch Evdokia Petrova. I use the term fetch loosely, and this is where things get funky and public. Upon the arrival of the couriers, by this point we can just say probably KGB agents considering the KGB was founded in March 1954, ASIO totally didn't let slip to the public, not at all whatsoever, that a woman was about to be taken, whether she liked it or not, from Australia to the Soviet Union to answer for her husband's defection. On the 19th of April, there was some quite violent anti-communist protests at Sydney Airport, as the KGB agents escorted Mrs. Petrova across the airport to the waiting aircraft. Prime Minister of Australia Robert Menzies got into contact with a message for the aircraft, and a flight attendant on board approached Evdokia and asked her whether or not she was happy to go back to the USSR. According to the flight attendant, she was racked with indecision and fear for what could happen to her family back home in the USSR, but it was clear she was terrified at the prospect of going back herself. The Prime Minister decided to take the choice out of her hand, noting that he could not allow someone to be removed from Australia in this way. And when the plane stopped to refuel in Darwin, because, well, it's the 50s, ASIO agents sequestered the Soviet agents under the grounds that they were stupid and carrying weapons. Which you think they wouldn't, because it's already an international incident and it's completely illegal to do on an aircraft flying in Australian airspace. Soviet arrogance has no bounds. The officers made formal the offer of asylum to Mrs. Petrova, which after a conversation on the phone to Vladimir, she accepted just as the plane was about to depart. By now, it was about the 20th of April. The Soviet agents were sent packing furiously back to the USSR, probably to answer for their crimes and be beaten severely because it's the USSR. The entire world saw what happened, and for a brief time it was front page news, with images of Mrs. Petrova being manhandled by Soviet agents at Sydney Airport becoming some of the most iconic images of Australia's 1950s. But our story doesn't even remotely end here, because Petrov allegedly brought documents confirming Soviet espionage in Australia at very high levels of the Australian government. It was Royal Commission time. The drama reached a new level within Australia when Prime Minister Menzies told the House of Representatives, think Congress, the Americans out there, how our system of government works, that Petrov had brought evidence that the Soviet spy rings were active inside Australia, and that there would be a royal commission to investigate the matter. Now, for those who don't know, Australia is a constitutional monarchy, and our head of state is the Governor-General, who is a representative of the Sovereign of Australia. In short terms, the Crowns of Australia and the Crowns of the United Kingdom are two totally separate entities that happen to sit on the same head. At the time of our story, this is Queen Elizabeth II. A royal commission uses the power of the Crown to get to the bottom of a problem. For example, there was one at the state level for police corruption in New South Wales, and if you didn't answer the questions, you would be held in remand by the Crown's authority until you do. A royal commission, in short, is designed to get the bad guy. You cannot plead the fifth in Australia, especially at a royal commission. You tell the truth or you go to jail anyway. Now, this part gets a little hazy. Because it was election season in Australia, Petrov actually defected just before the last sitting of Parliament before a federal election. And while it was very convenient that this evidence came to light, although given the time it isn't even remotely shocking that the USSR would have spies in one of the stronger Western countries in Southeast Asia, but it's very convenient that this came to light at this time for the party in power. Petrov's documents would be shown to the commission members, but never made public, and allegedly the Soviet spy ring listed amongst their ranks two members of the leader of the Australian Labor Party, Dr. H.V. Evatt, a constitutional lawyer and the leader of the Labor Party in opposition, appeared before the commission as the legal representative for his staff members, and his cross-examination of an ASIO witness led to the stalling of the commission and removal of Evatt's right to appear at the commission. This led Evatt to accusing the judges of biases towards the sitting government. Needless to say, Australia went a little McCarthy here, and further staffers and advisors from the Labor Party were questioned for sometimes weeks on end, due to even moderate communist connections. One of them was held for over a week in question because his mother was a communist. See, this whole affair absolutely set the tone for the ruling party in Australian politics for the next decade. Evatt accused Menzies of orchestrating this defection to destroy Labor's chances at the polls and the election that they were expected to win. Which is a little far-fetched because I don't think that Menzies had a hand in shooting Beria and terrifying Petrov, but our politicians have a flair for the dramatic, so don't worry about it. Something people tend to not understand is that there are, like in the States, two major parties in Australia. The Liberal National Party, at the time known as the Liberal Country Party, also known as the Coalition, and the Labor Party. The Coalition's colours being blue and green, and Labor being red. Yes, that's right, Liberal is actually conservative in Australia. Don't question it. Don't question it. Labor has always had a bit of an American Republic fetish and spells itself without a U for reasons, and the Coalition is today our conservative-ish party. This is all in theory at least. They're both pretty similar and they like to pretend they hate each other and that they're different, but in all honesty, politicians are politicians, and at the end of the day, the less I say about what I think about Australia's politicians right now, the better for our collective sanity. But either way, Menzies held power at the time with the Coalition under a slightly different name at the time, but in power nonetheless, and Labor was the opposition. This scandal caused Labor to break, with the Australian Labor Party fracturing and birthing the Democratic Labor Party. The DLP split from the ALP caused turmoil in the polls because Australia uses preferential voting. So if you voted DLP because you liked them and you liked that part of Labor that they were, your vote actually went to the Liberal Party under Menzies, which reinforced its power and kept it in government until 1972. If that made no sense to you, I get it, we are weird, wait until I explain democracy sausages one day. It's a whole thing, it's very Australian. Because of how embarrassing this whole thing got for the Soviets, they expelled the staff of the Australian embassy in Moscow and recalled their embassy staff from Australia. This freezing of Australian and Soviet relations would actually last until 1959. And depending on who you ask, the defection of the Petrovs led directly to the victory of the Menzies government in the election, although how much of this is as a result of the ALP's self-mutilation is a point of contention depending on what side of the aisle you sit on. The Royal Commission continued until the end of 1954, and it did uncover evidence of the USSR spying in Australia, but nobody was ever publicly charged with offences. It has been theorised that the reason for this was in order to hide any infiltration into Western intelligence services, in order to sort of adopt a wait-and-watch policy on those that it was known to be guilty. But this is all conjecture, of course, we will never really know the truth about this one. Evatt, furious that he had lost the election to what he saw as a conspiracy between ASIO and Menzies, wrote to the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, yep, that Molotov, the Molotov cocktail one, to ask whether or not there was espionage occurring. Shockingly, Molotov denied the accusation. Who could have seen that coming? Evatt, in what can be described as the dumbest political move he could have made, which makes no sense either because he's actually a very smart man, well, he's since passed now, took time in the House of Representatives to read out in full Molotov's response, and from that moment on he was a bit of a laughingstock, seen as nothing more than a Soviet puppet and a communist traitor by many in the electorate. Of course the media helped with that notion, but the idea of a member of a party who's meant to be possibly our future Prime Minister reading out a foreign minister from the Soviet Union's letter in front of Parliament? Not a good look, not a good look. The shattering of the Labour Party meant that they did not again win office, like I said, until 1972, spending decades in the cold in opposition, and their brief tenure in power would mean nothing, as they would soon be back in opposition shortly after the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. But my dear viewer, you now may ask, after our little sidetrack into the Land Down Under's politics, whatever happened to the Petrovs? For some weird reason, it was decided to settle Petrov in suburban Melbourne with Scandinavian names. They were called from this point out Sven and Anna Allison, which I guess kind of works, but I kind of like the idea of some old bogan going, "Hey Cheryl, want to have dinner at the pub with the Russian-sounding Swedish neighbours?" Prior to their internment in HM Prison Victoria, they lived in Sydney, in a safe house with ASIO officer Michael Thwaites. And Thwaites took the opportunity to actually ghostwrite memoirs under the title Empire of Fear, publishing them in 1956. If you get a chance, read it. It's a great little read. In time, the Petrovs faded into obscurity, living off an awarded pension as just two people in the suburbs. They would only appear again when a journalist got particularly bored and would attempt to reveal their whereabouts in spite of the gag order set in place by the Department of Defense. Vladimir would live a long life, dying in 1991, and Advokia died in 2002, outliving the Soviet Union. It is unknown whether or not Vlad continued his enjoyment of all things, shall we just say, hedonistic, following his little soiree. All in all, this was a little footnote though, in the great game of power politics and spies during the much larger Cold War, and at the end of the day the Soviets would bounce back. They actually infiltrated Asia in the late 70s, causing a tremendous uproar in which that it's only come out recently to date who their infiltrator was. Of course, Australia would get the last laugh when the wall came crashing down and the Union fell apart in 1991. But hey, it's a fun story. Especially when you could pop down to the Kingo for a schooner and sit right where the spy sat, having a beer while the cricket was on down the road. And I think I might just do that this summer when the cricket starts again. I hope you enjoyed this one. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.